You have a quote that I found, which is, "In this age, I don't care how tactically or operationally brilliant you are, if you cannot create harmony, even vicious harmony, on the battlefield based on trust across service lines, across coalition and national lines, and across civilian military lines, you need to go home because your leadership is obsolete. We have got to have officers who can create harmony across all lines." I'm very interested in this across coalition and national lines, because as military budgets are reduced, in the future, we're going to have to be able to do that.
You're 100% correct. Further, I have never fought in an all-American formation. I have always had allies, many of whom didn't even speak English, right beside us, fighting alongside us. And we have got to have the ability to see what they can do. We can't say, well, they don't have radios as good as ours, or they don't have jets as good as ours. There's plenty of room for everyone. My headquarters in Iraq, my division headquarters, was guarded by Tongan Marines from the little island nation of Tonga in the Pacific. And I asked them, what are you doing here? Why are you in Iraq? And they said, we have an international responsibility to stand with the Americans when they do something like this, because they've always stood with us. Friends need tending, but you can have the best of intentions break down on a battlefield if you don't have officers who are willing to listen to others and use them in a manner that they can be best used. I would just tell you too that Winston Churchill again has said the only thing more difficult than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. It is harder, but there are ways where you lay out missions and allow their commanders to select which missions they can do. That to me is a normal part of coalition warfare. Their countries take ownership of their forces. They're not giving them to the Americans to be used any way we wish. There are some caveats, is what we call it, national caveats. I've never found those to be a bar to imaginative use of their forces, still consistent with their political master's intent. So you've got to have this as the bottom line. And as we shrink the U.S. military, you're exactly right. This is going to be more important than ever. And if we can't do it well in our military, then even political alliances and coalitions will not make up for a brittleness on the battlefield. And yes, it's harmony. Operations today move at the speed of trust. That's the bottom line, and that creates this harmony that we need.
We're confronting a world with unbelievable problems. I mean, just tick off a couple. Syria. Iran, what do we do about their nuclear program? We have allies that sometimes don't always cooperate in terms of our national interests, say the Israel-Palestine conflict and searching for a resolution there. I guess what I want to ask you as a kind of an outspoken general on the one hand, but a very thoughtful general who is both a theorist and a practitioner. That's what I'll give you. How do you see the military contributing to this dialogue on they're very different issues. I understand that. But the military has ideas to bring to the table. Talk about how you see that playing out without necessarily getting into great detail about any of these problems.
Yeah. Let me talk about the themes I would adopt. If we don't fully fund State Department, I used to tell people on Capitol Hill, then please buy more ammunition for me because I'm going to get in more fights. So the first point is to make certain that we're not always reaching for the military or CIA when there's a problem. Let's make certain the traditional rules, the traditional roles of statecraft are used as well. Diplomacy, economic means, coalition building, that sort of thing. Now, certainly, if I were to sum up some of my missions in the Middle East, one was to make certain that the free shipping lanes, the shipping lanes were kept free for commerce and oil and all to move through, to stand by our allies when they were up against terrorists, that sort of thing. But the real mission I had was to try to keep what passes for peace in the Middle East, which granted Syria and Iran and everything else, but try to keep the peace or what passes for peace for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day, one more hour to allow the Secretary of State and the other political efforts to try to solve these maddening problems. And you're right, we're in a world awash with change and transitions and wars and the rest. So the military often is the tool that buys the time. It doesn't solve many of the problems. It can solve some problems. People who say war never solved anything haven't read our history. It solved slavery once and for all in this country. It solved putting Jews in ovens once and for all by Hitler. So the military can solve something, but it's a pretty brittle instrument. So especially in these wars among the people, we need to create more and more coalitions. We need to look at other ways to compete, not just military and CIA, and make certain we're using the traditional tools of statecraft. That the approach has got to be one of coalition building, of treating our friends well, and being willing to side with non-traditional allies, security allies, even when we don't agree with everything they do inside their country. FDR was a pretty progressive president, but he was willing to side with Stalin to defeat Hitler. I would think that we can also side with countries that are not perfect. We sometimes expect perfection from other countries that we don't expect from our own. And so we make these coalitions, and the military's role is to buy time, which allows for traditional statecraft to solve the problems.
And in the case of World War II, it was the American military that could defeat Hitler and stop what was going on, you know, in the camps. I guess that what I hear you saying, and actually there's an example that I heard you talk about. So the military can also be used to sort of diminish the rush toward war. There's the case of the Iranians threatening to close the Persian Gulf. Talk a little about that, because you used your military and you found a coalition there in doing that.
Well, and one point I would make is when the enemy's digging a hole, don't stop them. Let them continue to dig themselves into the hole. In this case, as you'll recall from a couple years ago, Harry, out of Tehran, they were constantly talking about their ability to mine the Straits of Hormuz, to stop the flow of oil. And of course, it sent shudders through the world economy repeatedly. And countries all around the world that rely on that oil, not so much the Americans, by the way, were very worried. But only the American Fifth Fleet was trusted by everyone out there to be the coalescing force. So as this was going on, I was growing increasingly concerned that because of all this political talk out of Tehran, some young zealot of a commander in the Iranian Republican Guard Navy would take it on himself to dump mines there, or they would actually make the political decision in Tehran. And I tried to think of how do we prevent this. So we came up with the idea of having the U.S. Fifth Fleet lead an international anti-mine coalition, not an anti-Iran coalition, anti-mine. Now, there's only one country over there that's ever threatened to use mines, but we were silent on that. We put the word out, and I assumed we would get maybe a half a dozen nations, you know, France, Britain, United Arab Emirates, kind of our usual friends and allies. In fact, the first time we ran it, 29 nations showed up. It included Canada, Estonia, Singapore, Djibouti, Japan. These are not bellicose nations, 29 nations. They showed up the next year, by the way, there was 35 nations. And under U.S. Fifth Fleet, they all came together. They discussed what they would do if there were mines put in the water. We then tested new technologies from the United Kingdom. We had divers from Djibouti underwater looking for mines and how they would go about clearing the straits. And when we were done, and we put it out on the press, we didn't hide it one bit, what we were doing. When we were done, we had convinced the Iranians to tone down the rhetoric, to stop talking about it. You've heard very little about this over the last 2 years now, because they realized they were actually creating a worldwide coalition against them. And by doing this, we reduced the chance for a mistake, a miscalculation. And at that point, we were buying time for then Secretary Clinton to continue to amass the economic sanctions against Iran and try to tone it down, use non-military means to try to solve this problem, since another war in the Middle East would be catastrophic. So that's an example of how the U.S. military, the only one who could have brought that many disparate nations together and buy time for the diplomats to do their magic, frankly.
One last question. Students watching this program, what advice you would give them about preparing for a future in the military? And as a little note here, I want to add a quote from you, where you say, "Now from a distance, I look back on what the Corps taught me, to think like men of action and to act like men of thought, to live life with intensity and a passion for excellence." How does that translate into preparations that students might think about for the future in the military?
There is a disappointing aspect to all this, that after thousands of years of living on this planet, we're still at a point where violence is used to settle differences. And it can be depressing for those young men and women who are choosing to go into the military. The point I would make is that no matter how bad any situation is, do not fall into pessimism or defeatism or cynicism, because all cynicism is a refuge that says, I don't have to do anything about this because, after all, it's such a bad situation, I exempt myself from having to work on it. So the first point is guard yourself and don't let the disappointment drive you to a negative view of the world. The second point is remember that America has the power of inspiration and the power of intimidation. And don't shortchange either one of those. Make certain that at times, if you can use the power of inspiration to bring out the better angels in people, keep trying one more month, one more week, one more day to do so, whether it be with a small village that's trying to fight terrorists or it's a high-level meeting. But at the same time, if you have covenants without swords, if you have no effective military, then your moral voice will never be heard as loudly. And dare I say that we just saw what Putin did in Crimea, and it may be that he thought he had an opportunity there, that we've not demonstrated a steadfast, basically that we're sticking with our allies. So I think you've got to recognize in the real world a combination between the ability to inspire and the ability to intimidate, and don't overuse one or the other, a blend of them. That would be my advice to them.